Well, chickens are sort of the gateway animal. There's really no question about that for those who are getting into homesteading. But are chickens the most economical animal sort of in their place as the gateway animal? Well, that's a question we're going to look at a little bit today. But if we can change it up, find some other ways to feed them and basically do the work where you're kind of exchanging your time and effort for the money, right? That's if you want the least amount of effort with the most amount of returns, spend the money. I don't think that matters what it is. If you're trying to reduce that sort of expenditure and still maintain the product, you're going to find that you spend more time. So it's finding the balance. So chickens is a gateway animal. I mean, it's fairly well known that chickens are readily available. They're relatively low cost, and in the grand scheme of things, they're relatively low cost as well to feed compared to a lot of larger livestock. But at the homestead scale, you still have to feed them, and feed costs next to infrastructure are going to be your biggest cost in having chickens. We've done sort of this little, I'm going to call it a mini series on some alternative ways to feed chickens. It's not complete, it's not comprehensive, and we will be adding more stuff in the future. And this is just some things that we've been doing to try to change the dynamics of the chicken feeding. Things like, I'll link it up above, feeding the chickens basically food that you've cooked for them, and also foraging or collecting things that otherwise would have been waste, which I'll link that one above too. But although those things, I'm going to say minus labor, tend to end up being free, I'm going to put that with air quotes, they don't make up the base of our chicken diet. And in this video up there, where we talked about basically our spreaded grain mixture, we've gone through different iterations of this. And essentially, our opinion on chickens is variety is sort of key when you're starting to formulate your own homestead diets, i.e. when you're getting away from the dependency of the prepared diets. As we've seen kind of over the last couple years, price fluctuations of a lot of the ingredients can really affect your bottom line. Now, one thing that we haven't really touched on yet, because it's not really foraging season for the chickens, we still have like 2 feet of snow, is foraging. And one thing we really find, and before I get into the numbers of what it cost us for 2022 to sort of keep our flock of chickens, foraging is a huge component of balancing the economics versus the returns of chickens at a homestead scale. You may not read that in every text that's available or see that in every video that's available on feeding chickens, but it seems to be a universal reality. If the chickens are allowed the opportunity, relative to the breed, some breeds forage better than others, and some breeds are more attractive to predators than others, so keep that in mind too. But if the chickens are allowed to forage for a substantial part of their diet during the seasons when they are able to, depending on where you live, it can make a huge difference. One of the things that we noticed was our flock size, I think it almost tripled during the summer, if I remember correctly, and the food that we were purchasing and preparing for them, we were able to basically keep it around the same level as what our much, much smaller flock that we sort of go down to during the winter months when forage isn't available required. So taking that foraging opportunity out is huge. And there's a lot of things you can do to sort of manage your homestead ecosystem to give the chickens more foraging options. But we'll touch on that later this year. Bottom line, we did a lot better in 2022 than we did in 2021, which I think is very interesting because, as I said, a lot of the feed prices were kind of volatile. They did come down towards the end of the year, and we did include, as we've kind of moved into 2023, we've included a few items that we had sort of taken out or made the decision to take out, which I'll touch on in a moment. So now we're coming to the numbers. And I think the numbers are always interesting. So maybe boring to some folks, but if you've got this far into the video, stick around because I think there's some interesting stuff embedded in here. Costs to feed our chicken flock, and this is our breeders, our egg layers, which kind of are the same thing, but also all the grow out individuals. So this is the total cost for the whole flock. So I'm going to start with the base diet of food and other items that we had to purchase for them regularly because we can't or don't yet produce them ourselves. First ingredient of the base diet is whole feed grade wheat. So for the entire year of 2022, that cost us $498.60. Now, there's likely no way in the short term that we could ever produce that much wheat or any grain for that matter to feed the chickens. So while the chickens are sort of the gateway homestead animal, I'm going to strongly suggest that even if you play around with feeds, unless you can grow a large amount of grains or have enough other biomass to offset those grains, i.e. you're collecting a massive amount of compost, you're going to be dependent to have chickens. So gateway, yes, not necessarily going to be the easiest livestock to be completely self-sufficient, to be honest. But I don't think in the grand scheme of things from a cost perspective that was too bad. We've lumped a few things because these items don't factor into a huge component of the diet or daily needs, and that's chick starter, shavings, and lentils. So all said and done, those items together was $154.09. Really, in the grand scheme of things, not that bad for an entire 365 days of a year. The lentils, of course, are human food grade, so they're a little bit more expensive, sort of per pound or per volume. And the chick starter is something we haven't quite figured out just yet. There are options, obviously, but that does seem to be somewhat important for that first little period. The next item was kind of an interesting one because both items are very good food items if you're trying to come up with an alternative chicken feed to get away from pelleted diets, but they both have their pros and cons, and that's sunflower and millet. So we lumped these together because these are the two items that really increased, like doubled / almost tripled in price at the beginning of 2022. And we made the decision that essentially they were going to be cut from the diet as we switched to some other experimenting. Now, we have since reintroduced a little bit of sunflowers over the winter of 2023 as we film this video, but a very small portion because they're still expensive. This is something that potentially you could, with some planning, grow, because the one thing we find about the sunflowers is the chickens consume them very well, which makes sense because they're a black oil sunflower, similar to what you would feed wild birds. They consume them very well in the winter, but not so much in the summer. Still eat them, but they don't love them quite as much. On the flip side, the millet, they do the opposite. We found that although they still eat it, they eat everything you give them basically, but they still eat the millet, but the millet during the winter months tended to get wasted more because it froze faster than a lot of the other grains, which seems kind of odd, but as soon as it froze, they didn't want it. On the flip side, the millet as a chick diet, or the basis of a chick diet, is still extremely promising and something we might experiment with again, even with the higher price, because without getting into the details, it could actually be used as a fairly substantial portion of the diet of your growing chicks. We may come back to that later in the year when we do some more research and some more experiments. Because we cut those items out fairly early, I think we only fed them for like about a month and a half, and they were $101.34. So that increase in cost was significant considering the other items were for the whole year. Those items were only for a very short period of time. Now, we did have two other additions to that, and that was corn and barley. The barley was a bit of an experiment because we find, like oats, the chickens don't love it. Our chickens don't love it. So we did some experimenting with both of these. And essentially that cost us $109.88. So added a fair bit more. So you can definitely see, for lack of any other better way to put it, feeding chickens during the winter months is going to cost you a lot more, at least double, if not more than that, than it's going to during the summer months if your chickens are allowed to forage. All that feed together, the total cost of feeding chickens for 2022 came up to $863.91, which is a lot better than we did in 2021. Although I will also say we had fewer chickens because we had some pretty big losses fairly early in the summer. to raccoons, which, well, I can link the video up there. A lot of that was our error, to be honest. Now, the chickens did bring in a little bit of income this year. We didn't pursue it too much because I'm going to say this, and hopefully it doesn't affect the video, but because of avian influenza concerns. Not that we had concerns on our farm per se, but in our general area, it was a hot topic, especially in the spring when you would kind of expect a little bit more sales. It also reared its head in the fall when we would have expected more sales of adult birds. So our sales were reduced, for lack of a better way to put it. We didn't really put things out there and we didn't really advertise a lot, but we still managed to bring in, or the flock still managed to bring in $240. That's not a lot in one sense, but when your total cost of feed is only $863.91, that actually goes pretty far. So if we use that value against what it costs us to feed them, that brings us down to $613.91. That's actually quite reasonable given what they produce for us. And this is where I think it gets interesting, because we did look and we did track what they produce for us. And we have sort of factored that in here a little bit based on the value of what they produced. So I'm going to dive right into that. I'm going to go with meat first, because the meat for 2022 was the lesser product. Not in quality, but in quantity. And a lot of that had to do with the losses, because when we lost a lot of chicks early in the year, because of the way that we managed things with broody hens, I'm going to say it, there wasn't a lot of opportunity to come back from that. So we will talk about this in a future video, but the rabbits really picked up the slack on the meat side of it. And I think that's where diversification to a point on your homestead is important, because if one thing has an issue, has a problem, or doesn't perform well for a given year, I mean, you don't want that to happen year after year after year, but for a given year, you can usually offset that for your own diet. So from a meat perspective, our birds produced 25.32 pounds of meat, which that's pretty low. But I will say we butchered a couple birds after the year ended, just a couple of roosters, didn't amount to a lot. And we kept a lot more hens this year than we typically would, because our plans this spring are to do a bit more selection when we get to the breeding pens. So we didn't butcher a lot, to be honest. I kind of did the back calculation to see what would that value be. And I'm saying value based on just normal grocery store prices. So if you were to buy 25.32 pounds of chicken meat, just your average run-of-the-mill chicken meat, what would that have cost you? So the price that I found was the average price right now. I didn't try to back calculate it to see what it was in 2022. Was $3.99 per pound for a whole chicken, which is usually one of the cheapest ways to buy it, because there's really been no extra processing done. Obviously, if you were buying chicken breasts or chicken legs or what have you, chicken wings, those prices are going to fluctuate per pound. But I wanted the whole bird price. So that works out to roughly a value of $101.03 that they produced in meat. And that's not price correcting for higher quality food. Considering most of our birds during the grow out period had access to pasture and natural forage, etc., I'm going to say it intrinsically, they probably have a lot higher nutritional value. And the other thing I will say too, that price per pound, there's no shrinkage. When we cook the partridge chanticleer meat, there's no water added. There's none of that sort of stuff that you typically do find, at least where we live, with commercial grocery store chicken. So you're actually getting that whole 25.32 pounds if you were to buy it, as opposed to having some water weight cook off. Eggs, I think, were really where it was at. And even though we still believe the partridge chanticleers are a good dual purpose breed, and there are lots of other dual purpose breeds, we really think the strong point to chickens throughout the millennia, and continues to be the strong point, is the egg production. So eggs, I think this was quite interesting. The chickens produced 1,034 eggs for 2022, which I think that's pretty good. That worked out to roughly 86.2 dozen. So we'll say 86 dozen. That's a lot of eggs. If we kind of use a price, and I mean, egg prices are still kind of fluctuating, kind of volatile, but if we use a price of about $4, potentially when we started 2022, it was a little cheaper. By the time we ended it, egg prices may have been a little higher, depending on where you were getting them from. At $4 a dozen for 86 dozen, that works out to roughly $344.67. So that's not a profit, but that's basically I'm going to call it a savings. Same with the meat. Those are savings, because if you had to purchase that food item, you would have had to spend at least that, if not potentially more. So when we take the eggs and we take the meat and we take that savings value, calculated savings value, keep that in mind, we basically get a total dollar value of savings of $445.70. That's significant. So when we go back to, and this is kind of a weird way to look at it potentially, but I think it really does help justify everything, because you would have had to buy that, and there's potential that you may not have been able to get it. That's a key concept. Whereas it's like the eggs, there was never an issue with us getting eggs. If we take that sort of actual cost that we've got it down to of $613.91, and we subtract sort of the estimated savings from it, which I know doesn't really work out practically in the books, but that really gets us down to the chickens only cost us $168.21. And you could potentially debate at that level, if you were buying sort of locally produced or more ethically produced chicken meat, for example, or eggs, that you might even be able to make that number disappear. And I think the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that even though some of the changes we did to the feeding system, 2022 was kind of a weird year because we had to omit a few staples that we purchased because the prices were just getting to the point that we couldn't really afford to do it, to be honest. And then we started doing some experimenting to see, well, could we come up with ways to maybe reduce the feed, etc. It is working. We're not there yet, but we are almost to the point that the chickens balance themselves quite well, keeping in mind that that may not happen every single year. So this was not necessarily the best year for raising chickens, but it was a very good year for us as far as keeping the cost a bit more reasonable, which is fantastic. And I think when you start looking at it this way, keeping in mind that those feed items right now would be very difficult for us to replace, i.e. grow. But if we can do some things to reduce the dependency on those, the wheat, for example, for the foreseeable future is going to be a steady expense. That's just going to be the reality of it for us. But if we can change it up, find some other ways to feed them and basically do the work, where you're kind of exchanging your time and effort for the money, right? That's if you want the least amount of effort with the most amount of returns, spend the money. I don't think that matters what it is. If you're trying to reduce that sort of expenditure and still maintain the product, you're going to find that you spend more time. So it's finding the balance. And I think that's where this is interesting to run through, because it gives you the numbers. It shows you during another year of transition that it can actually balance out fairly favorably, that the chicken still maintains its place as a very accessible gateway animal. But its cost to produce is extremely dependent on your management and your feeding systems and the amount of time and effort that you're willing to expend on it. And I suppose that time and effort that you're willing to expend on it really comes down to how much value does the actual act of raising, keeping, maintaining, breeding, and harvesting chickens and their products mean to you as a homesteader. Because when you can bring it down to sort of an actual expense of $613, and with the savings drop that even lower to the $161.21, I would say they're extremely high value, because the value of the items they're producing is pretty high. So that's some food for thought on chickens, and a bit of a breakdown of the economics of our chicken endeavor, keeping in mind that we maintain a flock of partridge chanticleers, and some of the parameters of how we do it are a little different than, definitely different than put and take, i.e. raising broilers or egg birds to, do it in a put and take manner. But it changes some of the dynamics here, because our costs are going to be a little different, because we do have to maintain that flock. But at the same time, that flock can work a little harder for us to help make it a little more sustainable. So hopefully you found this interesting. We're not going to, for those of you who've made it to this point, we're not going to run through everything that we've done this year and break it down. We've kind of already done that cost breakdown, and I'll link that video up there. We think we are going to talk about the rabbits because, as I said, the rabbits really complemented the chickens well. The chickens produce us the egg value, which is a huge amount of high quality protein that's going into our diet, and there's all sorts of other things that come along with that. The rabbits this year really did pick up the slack because of some of our chicken issues. So we're going to break that one down because we also feel that's fairly accessible to people, whereas some of the larger animals aren't. Anyways, I'm going to get going for the day, and we'll talk to everyone later.